on the 16th of October 1979, a few months following the release of their first album Unknown Pleasures. Post-punk band Joy Division played their first gig outside the UK at an old sugar refinery in Brussels, Belgium. The gig was not typical, as the event contained multiple mediums of art being performed in different rooms at the same time. One room for the bands, one for performance art, one for movie screenings, and one for live readings. Despite the event containing both Joy Division and Cabaret Voltaire, whom Joy Division was supporting, it was the live reading room that contained the main attraction of the event, as beat writer William S. Burroughs was performing inside. To 3/4 of the band, this fact did not mean much, as they were simply there to perform and do their best to be as memorable as possible to the Belgian audience. Yet to lead singer Ian Curtis, Burroughs' appearance overrode the importance of the entire event. Curtis had been an avid reader since he could remember, but it was in his teen years, when he was developing a taste for literature that pushed boundaries, that he stumbled across the works of Burroughs, and particularly his 1959 classic, Naked Lunch. Burroughs' unfiltered and experimental style of writing appealed to Curtis's angsty mind, and it wouldn't take Curtis long until he had read every single one of Burroughs' books, a fact that to Curtis deemed him worthy of getting a copy of Burroughs' new book for free. And so, having time to kill after their performance, the band went to watch Burroughs' live reading, and afterward, accompanied by guitarist Bernard Sumner and bassist Peter Hook, Curtis approached Burroughs with the intention of introducing himself and getting that free book he felt he was owed. What happened next has become legend. In fact, the entire story has, but regardless, nobody seems to know the exact details. Some sources say Burroughs refused to speak to Curtis. Other sources say all Curtis got from Burroughs was a get lost. However, according to Hook, who was hiding behind a pillar watching the interaction with Sumner, all he saw was Curtis walking over to Burroughs, a brief mumbled conversation between the two, and then Burroughs' voice piercing through the mumbling with, "Oh, fuck off, kid." With his head down, embarrassed, and most importantly, bookless, Curtis walked back to his bandmates, who had come out from behind the pillar, pointing and laughing. That night, Curtis's effect upon Burroughs' life was nothing more than an annoying encounter with a fan. However, unbeknownst to Burroughs, his effect upon Curtis's life, and particularly Curtis's writing, was monumental. Ian Curtis's life has become one of almost myth. Whenever a musician dies young, whether that be Jim Morrison, Kurt Cobain, or Elliott Smith, their life story tends to transcend from that of a regular step-by-step existence into a mythical-like martyr who gave his soul to his art and died in the process. What typically follows these deaths are the documentaries, the murals, and the biographies, all of which glorify the early death as much as they repent of it. And it is often the case that people, intrigued at what they know they can never understand, begin to dissect the life of, the pictures of, the footage of, and particularly in today's case, the lyrics of said individual, in an attempt to understand their mindset right before they died. And so, it really goes without saying that looking into the lyrics of Ian Curtis and relating it back to his suicide on May 18th, 1980, at the age of 23, has been done before, which is why I want to look at his lyrics whilst in Joy Division between 1976 to 1980 at a different angle. A literary angle. Curtis's lyrics were and are unique in that they display a poetic eloquence that was uncommon during the late 1970s, as the punk movement had influenced the majority of bands in England at the time to direct their energy outwards and bluntly. At the time, telling authority to get fucked was par for the course, and even Joy Division had gotten involved in this attitude early in their career. Yet once the band began to separate themselves from their punk roots, Curtis's lyrics had begun to move away from the external and towards the internal. Curtis had been writing poetry since before Joy Division, and it was after the cliché punk sound wore off that he resorted back to his poetry when writing lyrics. Poetry that was influenced by the works of writers like J.G. Ballard, Fyodor Dostoevsky, Hermann Hesse, Franz Kafka, and of course William S. Burroughs. Thus, Curtis's lyrics, as well as the musical accompaniment, helped Joy Division to transition from a generic angry punk band, telling the world to fuck off, into the frontrunners of post-punk, the next evolutionary step of punk, which prioritised a more atmospheric and introspective outlook, inspired lyrically by the authors Curtis would be influenced by in his incredibly short but esteemed life. Ian Curtis was born on the 15th of July 1956 at the Memorial Hospital in Old Trafford, Manchester. As a child, Curtis was described as a keen learner and lover of books. He was also said to have taken many of his personality quirks from his father, Kevin Curtis, who had a quiet demeanour and a love of writing. Being a bright child, Curtis was awarded a scholarship for Macclesfield Independent King's School at the age of 11, where he would develop his interest in literature and philosophy, and particularly to the former, the works of Ted Hughes, Tom Gunn, and Geoffrey Chaucer. Curtis would also go on to receive multiple awards during his time at King's School, and would be viewed by many teachers as a star pupil. Yet, despite being viewed in a positive light in the eyes of the teachers, Curtis had become disillusioned by the education system by the time he had reached sixth form in 1972, prompting him to leave at the age of 16 in search of full-time work. In the same year, Curtis was introduced through a friend called Tony Nuttall to his later-to-be wife, Deborah Woodruff. Tony and Deborah were dating at the time, and would often hang out with Curtis at his home in Macclesfield, particularly his room, where Curtis would lie on his bed and smoke, whilst the couple would mostly talk amongst themselves. Deborah would later describe Curtis's room as minimalist in a 1995 biography, Touching from a Distance, and she would note how the only objects of distinction were his greatest and only interests, his record player, record collection, music magazines, books, and his writing, the last of which he boldly kept out on display. Most telling of all was a black ring file holding lined paper and cardboard filing cards. Each filing card was labelled either novel, poems, or songs. I thought him rather ambitious, but he showed no signs of embarrassment about it. Whilst Curtis wasn't a complete loner in his teenage years, his spare time did mostly consist of either listening to music, writing, reading, or frequenting the many independent bookshops around the Manchester area. According to music journalist John Savage, the early to mid 1970s was considered to be a golden age of paperback selling. In the Manchester area, there consisted of many bookshops containing obscure or niche works, and of these many bookshops, there were 3 stores run by David Britton and Mike Butterworth that stood out amongst the rest. These were House on the Borderland, Orbit in Shude Hill, and Book Chain. Butterworth remembers seeing Curtis and later to be Joy Division drummer Stephen Morris enter House on the Borderland on separate occasions in the early 1970s, way before they knew each other, and Butterworth would describe them as disparate, alienated young men, attracted to like-minded souls. They wanted something offbeat and off the beaten track, and the shop supplied this. Not only the staff who manned the counter, but also some of the customers who came in. They probably saw the shop as being a beacon in the rather bleak Manchester of the early 70s. In the summer of 1972, Deborah and Tony unexpectedly broke up, and after getting permission from Tony to do so, Curtis began dating Deborah on the 23rd of December of the same year. In the early months of Curtis and Deborah's relationship, the two would once again spend time in Curtis's room, where Curtis would play records and dissect the lyrics of his favourite artists like Lou Reed, David Bowie, Iggy Pop, and Jim Morrison. Curtis would also write love poems to Deborah around this time, one of which he wrote to her on Valentine's Day in 1973. The poem references Andy Warhol and Lou Reed. I wish I were a Warhol silkscreen, hanging on the wall, or Little Joe, or maybe Lou, I'd love to be them all New York City's broken hearts, and secrets would be mine. I'd put you on a movie reel, and that would be just fine. The following year's Valentine's poem, however, would take a much darker turn. After a failed attempt at a breakup by Deborah in January 1974, following a series of jealous arguments instigated by Curtis, Curtis had sent Deborah a Valentine's Day card the following month that described a dream he had had in which Deborah was walking alone and lonely on an empty beach. Deborah, convinced Curtis was trying to scare her by revealing what a life without him might look like, threw the card away immediately and soon forgot about it. Ironically, a little over 6 years later, in June 1980, the poem would come true when Deborah was on holiday with her parents, walking along a beach in Scotland, a month after Curtis had committed suicide. Nevertheless, despite this small spat, the two would stay together, and on the 17th of April 1975, Ian and Deborah got engaged, and by the 23rd of August of the same year, the two were married. Ian was 19, and Deborah was 18. The following year saw the beginnings of the punk movement, spearheaded by the Sex Pistols, who on July 20th, 1976, made their second trip to Manchester and played at the Lesser Free Trade Hall. Ian, who missed the band's first appearance on the 4th of June, dragged Deborah along with him to witness the spectacle. In attendance that night was Bernard Sumner, Peter Hook, and Terry Mason, all of whom were school friends who had seen the Sex Pistols on their first visit to Manchester in June, and who were already sold on the punk movement. Ian, on the other hand, was just being indoctrinated, and after the gig, he introduced himself to the three friends. In the following months, Ian and the three would run into each other around Manchester when catching other punk acts, and would often talk about the bands they were forming, but that would often be missing a member. Hook would remember Ian particularly well during this time, due to Ian's large trench coat that had the words "hate" written on the back. Eventually, after failing to start a band on his own, Ian answered an ad for a singer in the record shop Virgin Records, which contained a number that so happened to belong to Bernard Sumner. When Ian called to apply, Sumner immediately gave him the position, on the basis that Ian was easy to get on with. Because I knew he was alright to get on with, and that's what we based the group on. If we liked someone, they were in. And so, just like that, Ian was in. Now Ian was the lead singer, the band was 3/4 complete, with Hook on bass and Sumner on guitar. Around this time, Ian and Deborah settled into a house in Barton Street, Macclesfield, in May of 1977. On the left side of the house was a room that would later become Ian's writing room, or the Blue Room, where Ian began writing lyrics in the evenings after work. Deborah would describe this time as feeling like a joint effort. Most nights, Ian would go into the Blue Room and shut the door behind him to write, interrupted only by my cups of coffee handed in through the swirls of Marlboro smoke. I didn't mind the situation. We regarded it as a project, something that had to be done. Neither did I inspect his work. I never doubted that his songs would be anything but superior. Before Ian joined, the band name was a work in progress that had stagnated on Stiff Kittens, but now with a new dedicated member on board, the issue of picking a good name for the band had reignited, eventually leading to the three agreeing on the name Warsaw. For the next month or two, Warsaw played sporadically around the Manchester area with ever-changing drummers, until an advertisement Ian had put up in Jones' music store in Macclesfield was answered by Stephen Morris. Morris's drumming had impressed the three, and he was on board. Warsaw was officially complete, and being a complete band, it was time for them to record an EP. Before recording, however, the band had been made aware of another band called Warsaw Pact, who was more established than them at the time. The band thus got together at a pub and brainstormed new names. two of them being Boys of Bondage and Slaves of Venus. Fortunately for them, Ian suggested a name they all liked and quickly settled on, a name that had originated from a book Ian had read called House of Dolls. The name, of course, was Joy Division. House of Dolls is a novella that was published in 1953 and is set in the concentration camps in World War II. In the book, Joy Divisions were the names of the groups of Jewish women in the camps who were used for the sexual pleasure of the guards. Flirting with Nazi imagery during the late 1970s was commonplace in punk, and Joy Division had decided to take the reference further on their first EP, released on June 3rd, 1978, called An Ideal for Living, as it contained a marching Hitler Youth on the cover. An Ideal for Living is a far cry musically from what Joy Division would become, as the 4-song EP captures Joy Division as they were still in their cliché punk phase. Ian is also still finding his niche lyrically on the EP, as his lyrics are focused on the external rather than the internal, and his singing reflects this outward aggression, as his vocals are more of a high-pitched Leiden-esque whine, rather than the monotone growl he would come to adopt in later releases. However, Ian's lyrics, while still in a developmental stage, show signs of talent, and especially in the second track, No Love Lost, which features a spoken word segment halfway through the song in which Ian reads an excerpt from House of Dolls. The excerpt describes the protagonist of the book, Daniela, undergoing a sterilization procedure, and the surrounding guards watching her through a wire screen, as into the cage of some rare creature in a zoo. This section of the song is short, yet it is in my opinion the most memorable part of the EP, and an early indicator of Ian incorporating his favourite works into his lyrics to break from the punk mould. In his autobiography Unknown Pleasures, Peter Hook would remember being struck lyrically by No Love Lost, and would retrospectively add that the making of An Ideal for Living marked the beginning of Ian finding his feet lyrically. I think you could point to that EP as being the moment that he truly began to find his feet in his writing and singing. All of the experiences he'd had with the band so far, watching other bands at work, reading, getting into Iggy and Throbbing Gristle, it was all coming together for him. It was shaping him into the writer that he became, which was arguably one of the best lyricists ever. Whilst the release of An Ideal for Living may have been a way of pinning down Joy Division's ever-evolving sound, the quality of the recording and pressing was unsatisfactory, and didn't do much to help get them to stand out amongst the other Manchester bands, besides give people the impression that they were Nazi sympathisers. Fortunately though, with the help of their new manager Rob Gretton, and co-founder of Factory Records Tony Wilson, Joy Division was able to contribute 2 songs, Digital and Glass, to the A Factory Sample EP. Due to the positive reception to A Factory Sample, and specifically, the songs provided by Joy Division, the band was offered a record contract from Factory Records, which gave the band a 50-50 split of the sales to their first album. The band agreed, and that album turned out to be the iconic Unknown Pleasures. Unknown Pleasures was recorded at Strawberry Studios in Stockport over 3 weekends between the 1st to the 17th of April 1979. The album was released just under 2 months later on the 15th of June. Lyrically, the album is focused much more internally than on An Ideal for Living, influenced due in part by the aesthetic shift Joy Division had taken and personal troubles within Ian's life, such as his diagnosis of epilepsy. Following the release of Unknown Pleasures, Ian was notoriously reluctant to expand on the meanings behind his lyrics, and would remain so until the end of his life. Ian would often tell journalists that he would prefer people to interpret his lyrics, and that he wrote very subconsciously, evidenced by his often non-linear style. Due to this style, when considering how Ian's lyrics were influenced by the books he read, you must look at the themes these authors presented, instead of the stories themselves. Themes of confusion about one's identity could be influenced by Hermann Hesse, death and suffering J.G. Ballard, and dystopias Aldous Huxley and Anthony Burgess, as they are all authors Ian read frequently at the time, and are authors that share thematic connections with the lyrics. However, one song in Unknown Pleasures does share a direct reference to an author he loved, that being William S. Burroughs, and the reference appears in the 9th song off the album, titled Interzone. Interzone sounds like the final remnants of Joy Division's punk origins being drowned in the same post-punk reverb that washes over all 10 tracks of Unknown Pleasures. The song features bassist Peter Hook on vocals, whereas Ian is on backup. The origins of Interzone came from an RCA Records recording session the band was doing, in which they were attempting, unsuccessfully, to cover Nolan Porter's Keep On Keepin' On. The cover never came to fruition, however Sumner borrowed the lead guitar of the song, sped it up, and from there the band revolved the rest of the track around the riff to create Interzone. The title of the song comes from an area in the city of Tangiers in Morocco called the International Zone, shortened to Interzone, and is featured in Burroughs' Naked Lunch. In Naked Lunch, Interzone acts as a debauched area in which drug-induced experiences warp reality, and the locals are all involved in salacious acts. Naked Lunch is a series of vignettes that are unordered and held together by a thin thread of heroin abuse, pornography, and disturbing tales. The book was written at a time when Burroughs was constantly strung out on heroin whilst living in Morocco, and the book is more or less a snapshot of the most disturbing and depraved tales of this time, mixed with the similarly warped thoughts in Burroughs' head. The song is thus a homage to these disturbing acts that occur in Interzone, and seems to feature a narrator finding his way around the area. Interzone begins with Morris's drumming, the Keep On Keepin' On riff, and a high-pitched animal-like squeal. The hazy confusion of the warped reality of the Interzone is reflected in the vocals, as Hook will sing one line, which will be quickly followed by one of Ian's. Lyrically, the song presents the narrator as both enjoying the depravity of the Interzone, whilst battling conflicting feelings of knowing he shouldn't be there. This duality of thoughts is accentuated by Ian and Hook's vocals, almost falling over each other in the mix. Ian also describes the Interzone as a labyrinth of industrial buildings and wire fences, and the sped up instrumental gives the listener the impression of living a fast life, not having enough time to think about what you're doing because you're having too much fun to care. Until, however, in the bridge, where Ian's lyrics break from the mould of the verse and chorus, and the narrator laments on the dark streets and similar looking houses, as if finally the narrator stops and looks around to realise the reality of the Interzone. These lyrics then conclude with a desperate cry from the narrator to try to find a clue and try to find a way to get out. At this point, the vocals momentarily pause, as if the narrator has finally broken the mould, but then the song picks up right where it began, with a high-pitched squeal and the Keep On Keepin' On riff, and the narrator once again finds himself roaming the depraved and industrial labyrinth of the Interzone. When Unknown Pleasures was released in June 1979, the indifferent reaction they had previously received from An Ideal for Living had turned into instant praise from fans and critics alike. It was ironic really, because at the time it must have felt like the only people who didn't like Unknown Pleasures were some of the closest people to it. Hook and Sumner had their own grievances with the album, mostly due to its production, but Deborah's issue was mostly influenced by Ian's lyrics. Joy Division had become a way for Ian to express the darkest parts of his mind and expose his obsession with themes relating to death, loss of control, and human suffering, which to Deborah worried her when she first read through the lyrics of Unknown Pleasures, as she described Ian as sounding as if he had lived a lifetime in his youth. And it's true, if you listen to songs like Day of the Lords, Insight, and New Dawn Fades, Ian's lyrics make him sound like an experienced old man who has seen the world's pain and suffering and understands the hopelessness of trying to prevent it. I think this element of Ian's lyrics comes from the books he was reading at the time, because according to Deborah, Ian didn't have a particularly troubled or traumatic upbringing to pull inspiration from. Yet regardless of this, Ian was obsessed with pain and suffering, and so would go looking for it in authors to draw inspiration from them. which became another cause for concern for Deborah when it became a daily activity. It struck me that all Ian's spare time was spent reading and thinking about human suffering. I knew he was looking for inspiration for his songs, yet the whole thing was culminating in an unhealthy obsession with mental and physical pain. When I tried to talk to him, I was given the same treatment as the press: a stony face and no words. Joy Division's second and final album, Closer, was released on the 18th of July 1980. Like Unknown Pleasures, it was received well. However, the positive reception was bittersweet, as Ian had committed suicide a month prior. When Ian died, it had seemed as if his suicide had come out of nowhere to the band, as he had died on the eve of their American tour, a tour the rest of the band thought Ian was excited for. When releasing the album, the band chose to keep all elements of it the way it was when Ian died, and when they read through Ian's lyrics, they realised that Ian was dealing with his personal issues by expressing them in his writing. Deborah would later comment when writing about Ian's use of his lyrics to truly express himself, that it was too incredible to comprehend that he would use such a public method to cry for help. Unlike Unknown Pleasures' Interzone, the two literary references in Closer are not taking an element out of the books they reference and building upon it, but instead are referencing these literary works in order to set the thematic basis for the themes Ian was trying to convey. However, only one of these literary nods was intentional, whilst the other was a happy coincidence after the fact. I will begin with the latter. Atrocity Exhibition is the opener to Closer and is named after J.G. Ballard's 1970 experimental novel, The Atrocity Exhibition. Curtis had written the lyrics to the song long before knowing about the book, yet he had been familiar with Ballard's work since his teens, and had read his 1973 novel Crash, which shares similar themes. Regardless, this is what Ian had to say when asked about the connections between Ballard's novel and the song. I'd written the lyrics way before I read Atrocity Exhibition, and I was looking for a title because sometimes I just can't think up a good title. Anyway, I just saw this title at the beginning of one of his books, and I thought that it just fitted with the idea of the lyrics. Sometime after I wrote the lyrics and the song had been established in our set, I read the book, and it is by pure coincidence that some of the ideas in the book are similar to some of the ideas in the lyrics. The ideas Ian refers to in this quote most likely refers to the suffering in human history, as both the book and the song expand upon this theme. Ballard's book is a collection of what Ballard called condensed novels. In these condensed novels, we witness a protagonist that undergoes frequent hallucinations, which typically involve violent scenes, in what at the time of the book being written was recent history. These hallucinations also include figures of this time, like JFK, Marilyn Monroe, and Ronald Reagan. Where this idea differs from the song is in the time frame in which Ian and Ballard draw from, as Ballard was looking to historical events that had occurred within his lifetime, whereas Ian was looking back centuries. Ian lyrically composes scenes of mental patients in an asylum performing for a crowd, people battling to the death in arenas, and death on massive scales. The idea of the song seems to be that Ian is pulling us all back in time to witness violent spectacles of history, which is laid out as if it were an exhibition we're being forced to attend. Ian also possesses a godlike aura in the song, and frequently tempts the listener to follow him inside the exhibition. This tempting is repeated in the chorus of the song, in which Ian sings to the listener, "This is the way, step inside." This beckoning similarly sets the tone for the album, as the remaining 9 songs following Atrocity Exhibition almost pull the curtain back on many facets in Ian's life that were causing him misery at the time. We can see this in the final verse, as Ian talks about the thousands he has picked on with his temptation, before concluding the permanence of all the suffering he has remarked upon with the lines, "Take my hand, and I'll show you what was and always will be." Colony is the 4th song on Closer, and is a nod to Franz Kafka's In the Penal Colony. in the penal colony is a short story about a device used to execute people by engraving their wrongdoings into their skin, resulting in a slow death that lasts 12 hours. However, halfway through the slow death, the person being killed often experiences an epiphany, or at least appears to. The song itself doesn't mention this device, but instead focuses on the location of the colony the device is in, likely as a way to express isolationism or an emptiness inside Ian. Ian also makes mention of broken homes and families in this song, and considering the well-documented breakdown of Ian's marriage with Deborah around this time, it seems as if this could be also related back to his troubles. Ian ends the song with these two repeating lines. "Dear God in his wisdom took you by the hand. Dear God in his wisdom made you understand." It seems as if this inability to escape God's plan by being made to understand fits with the often powerless protagonists in Kafka's writing. Like Kafka's powerless protagonists, Ian himself may have been trying to convey this powerlessness he felt due to his private troubles, and how these troubles had contributed towards him making the decisions he has made, and in the process, exiling himself from his friends and family, leaving him to stand there alone in this colony. You can tell a lot about a person by the books that he reads. As I said earlier in this video, the death of Ian Curtis has prompted both friends, family and fans alike to read into the lyrics Ian wrote whilst in Joy Division, in an attempt at prying into his mind and getting a better understanding of his mental state towards the end of his life. To an extent you can get an idea, as judging by the accounts of those closest to Ian at the time, he was always reluctant to talk openly about how he felt, and additionally, the way he acted amongst his friends almost contradicted the gloomy impression you got through the music. Knowing this, it would not be a stretch to imagine that the only truthful expression lies in the lyrics. However, that doesn't give us the full story. And neither does the full story materialise in looking at the books he read during his most productive years, yet it still does provide an interesting insight. Ian was fascinated by the darkest parts of humanity, and would read authors that could satiate this fascination, and that constant consuming of dark literature by all the aforementioned authors in this video likely helped Ian when writing. As Ian once said when asked about his writing process, "I don't write about anything in particular, I write very subconsciously." Considering the number of books Ian read during his life, it is possible that the themes and ideas associated with these works, from Ballard, Burroughs, Kafka and more, had almost been implanted in his subconscious and revealed themselves when he picked up the pen. It is a likely possibility, but unfortunately, we'll never truly know the extent to which these works influenced Ian when he would work late at night in the Blue Room. In later years, Deborah would help publish a book of Ian's writing called This Is Permanence. The book features copies of the handwritten lyrics to songs, as well as additional pieces of writing Ian had done before being in Joy Division. When interviewed on the subject of Ian's writing, Deborah would expand on Ian's love of words and literature, and would claim that had he not found himself in the world of rock, he would have instead been equally as successful in the world of letters. We grew up watching pop programs on television. That was part of the era, the rock star aspect. At the time, poetry was considered old-fashioned. It seemed like a logical progression to put to music. I don't think the fame and life on the road suited him very well. I think he would have continued to write even if he didn't want to perform. When he got to 40 or 50, he probably could have written a terrific book.